guys, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Amanda.
I'm Laura.
And I'm Kendra.
And I want to ask you a question. If you have ever met somebody who seems fiercely independent, avoids asking for help, and insists on doing everything on their own, I'm just thinking if you work in medicine, you've probably met more than one person that is like that, including maybe yourself. And what if it isn't just independence, but something deeper, something that we're going to talk about called counterdependence? So we talk about wanting to be in the sweet spot of connection, connected, but also protected, not codependent, but not too closed off. And that's from some of our previous episodes about Terry Real and his relational, therapy. And I feel like a lot of us focus on codependency and enmeshment a lot. I think that we kind of understand that, but we rarely talk about hyper-independence or counterdependence. And what flagged this for me is I kept, seeing things and reading things and listening to things. And it's like, hyper-independence is also a trauma response. And I was like, oh, maybe I should know more, because I do think I lean in this direction much more than codependency, but I've never considered it that there might be reasons why I do this. So this podcast will explore what counterdependence is, how it differs from healthy independence, some of the psychological roots, and then ways to address it. So first of all, what is counterdependence? The definition that we're going to use is when counterdependence is avoiding reliance on others, often as a defense mechanism against vulnerability. It's a fear of the consequences of depending on others. I just know a lot of us like this. So in other words, it's hyper-autonomy. It's on the other extreme of the spectrum from codependency. Again, there's a sweet spot in the middle, and it's swinging towards the other way, the closed off way. So some signs of counterdependence: reluctance to ask for help. And if being called needy or calling somebody else needy is kind of activating for you, like that's the last thing I would ever want to be. Okay, well, then maybe stay tuned. It's a mistrust of others, or I think for me anyway, like the concern that they're not going to be able to, not a mistrust of others in general, but like maybe they can't come through in the way that you need them to, or maybe you just think it's easier to do it on your own.
Or sometimes you have family that holds it over your head, like counts costs. And so they do all the things for you growing up. I was there for you. I bought you nice things. You were provided for, la la la. And then something happens and you can't return the favor. And then they let you know about it. And so that makes also some real mistrust of family members and makes you want to never ask for their help again.
Exactly. So at least how I was understanding it with these articles and such, it's like the fear of the consequences if you relied on someone, because you've probably been burned before,
Right.
Or you've probably either been completely ignored and learned to just deal with it on your own, or the reaction has been so strong that it became a bigger problem than just dealing with yourself in the first place. So discomfort with emotional closeness can be a sign of counterdependence. And so you might have been told that maybe you're intimidating or you seem aloof. And then another characteristic, which all of us see all the time, is overcompensation through self-reliance and hyper-independence. Now, let's talk about, because all of that sounds great, right? But let's talk about healthy autonomy, which is what we're shooting for. The key in understanding counterdependency is differentiating it from healthy autonomy. Healthy autonomy is a state of confidence or self-reliance in which the individual, number one, appreciates their interdependency with others. Like you're aware of it, you're not bothered that you're part of a squad, you give, you take. It also has, if you have healthy autonomy, you have a sense of agency that you can effectively control your own destiny. And then also you're not overly controlled or influenced by others. A primary defining feature of healthy autonomy is first that the individual desires to be relatively self-reliant, not because they're afraid of consequences, but because they want to recognize their full potential as an individual. But it also is totally fine with being securely interconnected with others. Secondly, healthy autonomous individuals can regularly share, they can be vulnerable and comfortable relying on others when it's reasonable to do so. So compare that to counterdependency, which on the surface, like honestly, counterdependency may look very similar to healthy autonomy. I think that's why it's never occurred to me that like maybe there's reasons why I've just always assumed I'm an independent person. But what drives counterdependency is an avoidance mindset, namely the avoidance of relying on others because of a fundamental mistrust of the consequences of doing so. And so, in addition, although these individuals might have superficially positive relationships, because they are usually unwilling to fully let go, their relationships don't always go as deep. So, indeed, even in a marriage, these people can totally be married. A counterdependent can still hide core aspects of their experience with their spouse. They can still resist showing dependency needs, be unwilling to ask for help, even from their spouse. They can be reluctant to opening up and preferring to stay superficial. Everything's great. We don't talk about problems in this house. We just smile and carry on and avoid opportunities for deep emotional connection.
Yeah, that's interesting because it's interesting that it's like avoiding vulnerability. I didn't ever think about it that way, that it's a defense mechanism, really, or a coping strategy against trying to be vulnerable. And in a marriage, that shows up. I mean, I can definitely appreciate the resistance to dependency, but also like going into a marriage probably with already these characteristics, but then in the marriage never really being shown evidence for the other person showing up in any way, or like wanting it to be there but not maybe communicating that, but just like waiting for an experience to happen, like I'm waiting for you to show up, like help out or whatever, but never like saying anything. And then like not blame me, but just seeing like, see, just they never show up. So this
Yeah,
is
just further evidence that you
it's
should have never
further
tried to.
evidence that I'm just gonna have to take
Yeah.
care of everything myself. But once again, your brain looks for the evidence of what you're thinking. And if you're thinking that they never show up, your brain's gonna look for all that evidence.
But also in marriages, you seek out somebody who replicates some of your experiences as an opportunity for healing. However, a lot of time, I would say a lot of the times you just get re-injured over and over and over.
Mhm.
It's the opportunity to heal, but I don't know that happens all the time. I
Mhm.
know it doesn't happen all the time. With this whole, like, the articles and stuff, I was just like, oh, shoot, this is everywhere. And one of the articles was like, he asked his psychology grad students, what is counterdependence? None of them knew. Like,
Mhm.
this isn't as known, I don't think.
And to have language now to like explain your experience kind of gives you that awareness, and you're like, oh yeah, that might be it.
Yeah. Sometimes this is referred to as toxic independence. And so
Yeah.
people may be more familiar with that term. And like, just to be fair, sometimes it's good judgment not to be vulnerable and not to, like, especially if you're growing up in a situation where you have really reactive parents, you learn that it's like Terry Real talks about,
Mhm.
that is your adaptive, that's your childhood adaptive protective mechanism. And it's great judgment at that time. And it feels normal. It feels like how you're supposed to be. But as you grow up in our adult relationships and you're no longer in physical or emotional danger, you just have to assess, is this really helpful for me? And you may be in a relationship where you're still in, like, it still doesn't feel safe to
Mhm.
be vulnerable if you have a partner who's really reactive, or you might be avoidant in some situations and not in others. But sometimes it actually is good judgment to not rely on people and to not be vulnerable, but to identify it as a personality characteristic, that in no situation am I going to be vulnerable or rely on people. that's where it's probably unhelpful.
I don't think I would have even identified as toxic independence because I wouldn't have even recognized I was doing it on purpose. Like
Right.
toxic independence seems like I'm doing it out of spite. It makes good
No.
sense
Yeah.
why I have these tendencies, but it might not be serving me in the best way. I do like the idea that it's an adaptive child response. You did what you had to do, but is it still helping you now?
Right.
Yeah, and could be the very thing that's preventing that deep emotional connection that you actually do want with
Yeah.
your spouse. And you're like, why can't we get there? And you're like, I don't know. Maybe a little awareness. John Bowlby's attachment theory highlights how avoidant attachment styles shaped in childhood, like we talked about, our adaptive child, leads to a fear of closeness and dependence in adulthood. So, as we were just talking about, it's protective maybe in childhood. It actually serves you because it kind of protects you and allows you to continue to function. Avoidant attachment can arise when caregivers were not emotionally attuned to you, leading to the internalization of I can't depend on others. Since being emotionally attuned isn't a violent act, it sometimes isn't noticeable or memorable, like we said. It was just modeled, and you were like, it's not necessarily hurting me outright. It's not like verbal abuse, emotional abuse, anything like that. But it's that either the caregiver was not attuned, didn't have time. They could have been avoidant just simply because they were just working two jobs to
Exhausted.
pay the bills and just weren't around and weren't available, or their own hurts and fears and lack of vulnerability were not available to then show up for you in that way. So it can be really subtle and kind of like a little messy, and it as we talk about it, it can be seen as a maladaptive coping strategy. Like we talked about the adaptive child, or that like keeping people at an arm's length, like the mistrust, like I just can't trust anyone. It's that blanket statement. And it can come from the fear of rejection by the person, but also fear of enmeshment. Like people, like that is triggering to me if someone were to say, man, she's being needy. Like that is activating to
Yeah.
me. Like I do
Yeah.
not want to be involved in that situation at all. And so really for like staying like that kind of bipolar, like going as far away from enmeshment as possible, you might develop this strategy.
Yeah. I just thought that was interesting because I think you automatically come to mind like you were ignored as a child, so you just were independent on your own. I'm fascinated with the idea that it could also be you opened the doors once and somebody came all the way in and moved in. Trying to keep somebody from being codependent on you too would be a reason why. Or just it wasn't a match. Like what you needed wasn't what you got. And how many of us have emotionally immature parents? Almost all of us, because nobody teaches us how to regulate our. So it's not even a malicious thing. It totally makes sense if you tend to do this.
Yeah, and generationally, you are just getting the tools that you're given, and you're doing the best you can with the tools that you got. And without this like awareness, you're just continuing to function kind of out of the adaptive strategies that you developed, like as your parents and their parents and their parents and their parents. Like it's just
Yeah.
adaptive strategies. And until you're like aware that maybe this isn't very good, it just continues.
I could even imagine that it's not even a caregiver situation, but like if it's your go-to as a sibling group to just tease the bejesus out of somebody who's having an emotion, I would think that that would be maybe your caregivers did everything perfectly, but then you definitely learned a survival strategy. I'm not going to open up to siblings, or maybe it happened in your friend group or whatever.
Yeah,
Or medical
definitely.
training. Like,
Yeah.
did it feel safe to be vulnerable during
Yeah.
residency and as med
No.
students? No,
Right.
like we all learned that showing vulnerability was dangerous. So that's just food for thought.
Yeah. Cultural studies suggest that individualistic societies, like here in the US, may glorify independence, inadvertently reinforcing the counterdependent behaviors, whereas collectivist societies tend to emphasize interdependence. And we touched on this a little bit well, I would say every time we talked about a blue zone. One of the things that these blue zones do, they are collectivist societies. They are interdependent. It is very well established that it takes a village. Like people that say that, this is where it came from. These collectivist societies that are known for their interdependence, and it works well. They live to over 100 and they very well to 100. So there's something to be said about that. And maybe the US could look a little bit into this and maybe just not shift the pendulum all the way, but at least come to some sort of, happy medium or sweet spot, as we talk about.
I think that's interesting because I think you're right that it probably is the blue zones. But usually when I hear the term collectivist, I think of like communist. And I don't think that that's what it's talking about, because I don't see.
I don't think emotions go over very well there either. So.
Yeah,
No,
I don't think that's a healthy. I don't think that's a
No.
healthy interdependence. I think you get your rights.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think you're talking about the blue zone.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Definitely not under submission. You not forced submission. But so one of the things also that we kind of touched on a few minutes ago was increased loneliness, stress, and difficulty forming the deep emotional connections. These are all things that tend to come out of someone or a situation where you are aware of counterdependence. And that's like exactly opposite of what we were talking about, the blue zones. Like they are low stress societies. They don't even have an opportunity to be lonely because they're interdependent and it works well. And those deep emotional connections are there because it's always been safe. They create a safe space for vulnerability. And so the connection is there and it's carried on generationally. And so those collectivist societies or those villages that create that safe space for vulnerability do offer up the deep emotional connection. Another consequence of counterdependence is strained relationships. Or superficial relationships that maybe aren't strained, but they don't ever go deeper. They don't last because anything that comes against a superficial relationship is going to strain the relationship. And if there's no trust there or vulnerability there, there's nothing to build on. And so it crumbles. And so I just think about so many of these, not to put celebrities out there, but just, you see celebrity relationships and you don't know what they're going through. But, if they haven't been modeled to build trust and vulnerability in the status that they are in society, any stress or strain on that relationship is going to cause it to go down in flames. And I think another part about it is the relationship dissatisfaction and the reduced emotional intimacy. So this is the same thing, staying on that superficial level, never being vulnerable with your, significant other, or if you create expectations of them. Like I said, if you even, test the waters of maybe I can depend on them, maybe I can see if they'll show up. And if you haven't been clear about your requests, or if you haven't been clear about what you would like, they may not know that. And so you're going to be chronically dissatisfied. And you're not going to want a deeper connection, right? Because they're just not showing up for you. And then increased emotional isolation and burnout. So that's why we're talking about this, because I would say subtly, some of this shows up as our medical burnout. And so it's not just the institution or our hospitals or the medical world as we talk about. It is some of this strain on the relationships and some of this tendency to kind of emotionally isolate because we've just never been shown a safe space to kind of hash all these feelings and emotions out and work with some of these thoughts. And so that's, really why the whole physician exists. It's our passion project. It is to create a safe space, one that has never been cultivated before amongst physicians, amongst colleagues. Like this is what this is. Physician coaching is creating, it is doing the exact opposite. It's creating a safe space. It's asking to go deeper. It's connection. It's community. And it's really a way to de-stress because it's a safe space to really get it all out and to work through these thoughts that you're having in a judgment-free zone. Like not being asked to do the things or show up in a way that you aren't ready for, and it's being there when you are. And so this can create, that deeper emotional connection or give you the tools to really foster those deep emotional connections. it can also allow you to be confident in the patient-physician relationship. I know when I have, recognized or aware of some of these things that trigger, and you work through all of that, I feel that I'm more confident in front of the patient, no matter what they say or do or how they show up. It just seems to be not a factor anymore. Like, I'm still able to provide the care. And I'm not saying we have deep emotional connection with our patients, but you're able to be a little more confident and less reactive in situations with that patient physician relationship, because they're not showing up probably, ideally, but you get less triggered because you're like, have this, I can show up. I can be intentional in how I show up in it. And it allows you to kind of stay neutral.
Yeah, I love that. And I totally agree. It's just very rewarding to see what providing a safe space does for doctors. It's really, I don't know, it's a beautiful connecting time and so healing to just have a space where you can like spew it out. That's so good. All right. So, what are some steps that we can take toward healing and balance? Well, number one is just becoming aware. And that's always the first step, is just to realize that maybe your independence, or maybe the way we operate in the world without asking for any help ever and not trusting people, is not really who we are, but it's a trauma response, or maybe an adaptive child way of doing things that might actually not be serving us the way we think it is. So if we're noticing that maybe we have a reluctance to ask for help, or if we have discomfort with emotional dependence or emotional connection, just being aware of that is a good first step. Brene Brown, we adore this woman, and her work on vulnerability it's really life-changing if you dive into it. She emphasizes that simply acknowledging fears of dependence is a critical step towards healing. And in therapy, therapy is not something that doctors are known for seeking out, but it can be incredibly helpful in opening up our minds to see some of these deeply ingrained beliefs that we have about dependence and independence. There is a therapy modality called internal family systems that is really interesting. And what it does is it kind of shows different parts of your mind and the way they operate to help you be functional. And where you may have something really wounded in the middle of your mind, and then you have these other parts of your mind that are acting as protectors. And so that protector part can show up as this very independent person that is protecting us from harm or perceived harm, and it actually can kind of show up as controlling or sometimes even harsh. But knowing that what it's trying to do, it's trying to keep that hurt part of ourselves from being injured again, and trying to keep us from being harmed or disappointed. So its intentions are good. However, the fallout can sometimes be negative. And so obviously therapy can address that stuff. It can address childhood experiences that may be contributing to these patterns. Like, when did that protector show up? When, and what purpose is it serving? So here are some practical tips for you, for all of us. Start to become interested in our own emotions and validate them. Well, again, we as doctors many times identify as emotions just more thoughts. We've got several episodes on emotional granularity, and the first step towards emotional intelligence is learning what our emotions are and learning to recognize them and name them. So that's a key one, is noticing our emotions. And by validating, we mean just say, it's completely understandable why we would feel that way now. You may not have experienced this as, from a caregiver. Some of us had the suck it up buttercup starting early in childhood.
Mm-hmm.
You know, emotions were not welcomed. Emotions were shamed, or we were told to just get over it, put some butter on it and forget about it. This is something that is often done in therapy, is reparenting, where we can reclaim that and help ourselves develop some emotional intelligence that we were denied. And so when we're self-parenting, we start to give ourselves that nurturing that we didn't receive. And this, like, honestly, if you haven't done this, it sounds a little out there. However, I will say this is a very powerful thing that you can do to help heal yourself. Give yourself that nurturing that you didn't receive as a child, and speak kindly to yourself. And we talked about this over and over again, how doctors in general have negative self-talk going on a lot of the times. Sometimes it helps us get where we want to go. Many times it's very self-destructive to us. And a lot of times that negative voice in our minds actually is the voice of a parent or someone else in our past that spoke to us that way. So it's really important to recognize it, realize, a lot of what it's saying is probably not true. And the way it's saying it isn't helpful anyway. So we can look at ourselves and remind ourselves, just like a loving parent would, you belong, you're capable, you can ask for what you want and need, and you're lovable just the way you are. And I will say too, this is something that you will experience in coaching for sure. At least with us, we definitely want our clients to achieve goals, but we always will say what you're experiencing makes complete sense. It is completely valid the way you feel now. And what do we want to do? What do we want to do about it? There's nothing you can do that makes you more or less valuable as a human being. You belong and you are valuable. So if you haven't experienced that and would like to, come and talk to us. We love doing that. It's very, very healing. So if there's unprocessed trauma, especially if you have autoimmune disease, if you have, a backache that just won't go away, if you've got hives, if you've got mystery maladies, or you just know that you have something that is unresolved trauma, go to therapy. We're hopefully getting past the time where that was not cool for doctors. It is not cool to not go to therapy when you need it. And find a therapist that you feel comfortable with and allow them to do some of this work with you, like the internal family systems or EMDR, or there's numerous other trauma therapies that can help overcome some of those deeper hurts that may have happened earlier in life. And take comfort knowing that you're not alone in this tendency. I'd say probably more doctors than not would fall somewhere in that counterdependency arena. If we didn't learn it in childhood, we definitely learned it in training, that we need to be self-sufficient and not to trust and not to be vulnerable. Obviously, that doesn't help us in our adult relationships though. So therapy, another vote for therapy. Observe your discomfort with interdependence. So like when you push people away, or you're trying not to rely on others for things that would be reasonable to rely on them for, why? What is the problem here? Identify that underlying fear. One fear might be fear of being controlled, or fear of disappointment, or fear of hurt. It's just super helpful to know why. Why is it that I'm doing that? And is it reasonable in this situation? Many times it's not going to be reasonable. And if you are truly in a situation where it is reasonable to not trust people around you, that's good information as well. Start small. Ask for help with minor tasks. Like, the reality is that doing everything ourselves doesn't promote a great environment for us or for the people around us. It promotes connection when we can ask other people for help and give them the opportunity to bless us. I mean, I personally like helping people who need help. And why do I want to deny that to other people who can help me? And I mean, for me, I was totally this way until I had committed myself to the point of my wheels falling off. And I've had to learn this. I've had to learn this. And it's an ongoing learning for me personally, but it's not going to kill you. It's not going to kill you to ask for help with some minor tasks. And then when people offer help, take them up on it. That again is not going to kill you. You might feel uncomfortable, but just notice it. And why would you feel uncomfortable when they are actually offering to help you? What is the problem with just accepting some of that help? And then gradually, purposefully open up to some trusted individuals. If you're not already doing this, find some safe people to build some emotional closeness. Hopefully you have this already, but if you don't, think about who might be someone that you can open up to. And as you're working on your relationships, working on building those healthy relationships where you can express your feelings directly and honestly and not be concerned about the reaction or of being, like Amanda mentioned, like being teased. This even happens in adult relationships, but it is definitely a childish dynamic. Be aware of where you can learn to open up more, where it is actually safe. And be mindful of your tendency to try to controlling situations or controlling other people, and try to work on allowing others to have the opportunity to contribute. Practice active listening and empathy towards, if you have an intimate partner, towards your intimate partner, and get into their emotional world too. That will help soften your own hard shell of independence and increase that connectivity that we all want. Brene Brown, again, underscores the need to redefine vulnerability as a strength rather than a weakness. And I 100% agree with her. If you think about the people that you would feel safe with, it's not other toxic, independent people necessarily. A lot of times, if someone is able to show vulnerability and make it safe, that feelings are okay and it's normal, and yeah, we're all human and we all need help sometimes, that is where you're going to feel safe. So we can start being that person for other people too, as we learn to shed this shell. It really is like a protective shell that we develop for ourselves. And it, again, makes so much sense when we're not safe, when we're kids and we don't have control over life and the adults around us aren't reliable to provide the support we need. It makes sense. However, to reach our full potential in our intimate relationships, in our relationships with our kids and the people around us, we've got to shed that shell and take that risk and know that even if we feel hurt, we can manage. We're not going to die. We don't need armor to carry on in day-to-day life.
But again, you can start small. Don't
Yeah.
go straight to a not trusted individual and spill your guts and then just get throat punched.
Oh, definitely not. No. Again, there's judgment, there is wisdom, and like it made good sense to develop this like protector, to develop these defense mechanisms. That makes complete sense. But
I think even Brent says, like, not everyone has proven that they have earned your trust. And so
no, definitely
you don't need to be
not.
vulnerable to everyone.
No. And that is not something we would ever recommend, is just like go, share all of your deepest angst with everyone you know. But if you're not sharing it with anyone and you don't feel like you can, that's where it's maladaptive. It is important to find save people where you can share.
Yeah. If you overshoot on the other direction, then you're just going to get more evidence that counterdependence is the way to go.
It's true. 100%.
Yeah, definitely. And probably more or less dipping our toes in this water is probably going to go slow because, like I said, we're going to test the waters and just see if we find those individuals available. But if this has helped you today, talking about counterdependence, or if it's triggered you in any way and have had any experience with counterdependence, or you're like, oh, that's what that is, email us at podcast@thewholephysician.com and tell us about it. And we always encourage you, leave us a 5-star review and jot down a few sentences because it helps other doctors find us and it makes our ripple that much bigger. Don't forget, we have a new video called How to Crush Physician Burnout for Good Without Cutting Back Hours, Quitting Medicine, or Sucking It Up in Silence. So scroll down in the show notes and click the link to check it out today. Until next time, you are whole, you are a gift to medicine, and the work you do matters.